Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Awareness Podcast with your host this week, Bill Free. And it's my pleasure to invite a guest this week that will be part of our next conference, Many Paths, One Self. And I'm going to give a little bit of background on Steve Taylor, and then we'll bring him on. So Steve is a senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University and the author of several best-selling books on psychology and spirituality. He is a past chair of the transpersonal psychology section of the British Psychology Society, and he's a poet. His newest book coming out in April is Disconnected, and it's about regaining awareness of our connection being the only way by which we can live in harmony with ourselves, one another, and the world itself. And other books by Steve are Extraordinary Awakenings, When Trauma Leads to Transformation, The Clear Light, Out of Darkness, Back to Sanity, The Calm Center, The Leap, and Spiritual Science. And Steve's books have been published in at least 20 languages, while his articles and essays have been published in over 100 academic journals, magazines, and newspapers. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Steve Taylor. Thank you for being here, Steve. I appreciate it.
Hi, Bill. Great to be with you.
Yeah, so you can, I mean, already you can, you know that Steve is across the pond. He's over in UK where some of our other hosts are. Susan Telford in Scotland and Jenny Beale is in the UK. So we seem to be gravitating the pull to that part of the hemisphere. And I really appreciate you being part of this awareness podcast, Steve, because it will give, not only will it help people to realize the resources that you provide in so many areas of spirituality, awakening, psychological, and the pointing that you're an expert in, but I also consider you to be an expert in awakening, mostly because you've done so much research in this area. So, when I started looking at your background, I went, oh my God, this guy's kind of a awakening expert. And you don't give that as a part of your bio, but
I like the sound of that. I could use that. I like the sound of that. I could use that from now on. Awakening experts.
Well, why not? Well, the research is there because I've been looking. I mean, if we go to your website and we look at the different testimonies of people's awakening experiences, you've done a fair bit of research on.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I have my own experiences, and my research stems essentially from my own experiences, and I've always felt that awakening is much more common than most people realize, and that it happens to people outside the context of traditional spirituality. So that's what I found in my research. I found that awakening can happen to people who don't know anything about Buddhism or non-duality or anything about spirituality in general, people who've never meditated or never been to a retreat or met a guru, just people, just seemingly ordinary, in inverted commas, people living in the midst of everyday life.
Yeah.
So, particularly in the context of intense psychological turmoil, that seems to be the main trigger of spontaneous and sudden awakening.
Yeah, I heard you say that recently in an interview, and I found that to be very interesting. You gave an example of a guy that had an awakening experience in Vietnam that you talked about.
That's right. Yeah, that was a guy who sent me a report of an experience he had. I think it was the late 60s in Vietnam, as you say. And he was somebody who didn't know anything about spirituality. He was a young guy in his early 20s. And, he sent me this really dramatic, really detailed report of being on the battlefield. And there were soldiers around him were being airlifted out of the battlefield away from danger. And he was surrounded by carnage and he was in danger of dying himself. And in that moment, he had a sudden experience of liberation. He suddenly felt that he wasn't just inside his body. He was everywhere. His awareness expanded so that he could see the whole of the scene around him. But he felt this amazing sense of freedom and euphoria, and this feeling that there was something inside him which would not or could not die. There was something inside them that was beyond his physical body. And it only lasted for a few seconds, but it was enough to change his life, so that when he returned from Vietnam back to the US, he instinctively knew that there was something spiritual about it, even though he didn't really understand what spirituality was. But he gravitated towards meditation, he investigated Buddhism and other traditions. And he realized later on that he was trying to recapture this experience he'd had on the battlefield. And he told me that, he was quite an elderly man by the time I was in contact with him. And he told me that he'd never managed to fully recapture the experience, but he'd had glimpses of it. And it was somehow enough to know that that experience was there, and that potentially he could return to it. And he had returned to it, but just not in as an intense a way as originally.
Yeah. That first, he had the big daddy experience. Yeah. We don't all have the big daddy experience. Most of us have glimpses, and we don't really know what it is when it's happening. It's so unusual, and it's so it's a little bit mystical, and a lot of people will just have that experience and say, well, I don't know what that was, but that was weird, and they'll keep going, or maybe they'll investigate it a little bit. Or they'll, their readiness will reveal to them. They'll have that listening device that comes on when you're ready, and all of a sudden you start hearing and seeing and being in the proximity of that thing that is drawing you to itself.
That's right. I found actually some people may even repress the experience because they don't understand it. They haven't got the worldview to make sense of it. So they'll kind of, they'll have it and then kind of push it to the back of their awareness and try to forget about it. Particularly people who have adopted a kind of materialistic mindset, that excludes spiritual experiences.
Yeah.
But, but obviously you can't repress these experiences forever. They always return. And eventually, you will return to that awareness. But certainly for a while, people do repress them because they can't make sense of them sometimes.
Right. Well, I like what you were saying at the very beginning, when you said that most people don't realize, or they don't realize how simple it is, and how normal or natural it is. And because of that, I feel like it's easily dismissed. And people, because of our materialist mindset, it gets bulldozed. It gets pushed back into the background of experience again, unless there's an interest.
Yeah, or maybe in a more extreme way, people may think they've gone crazy. Because they may tell their friends about this experience, and they say, "Oh, have you been taking psychedelics, or have you gone crazy?" Yeah. So after a while, they may think, "Wow, maybe I have gone crazy." I actually there was one guy I interviewed who'd had an experience when he was in prison. He was in prison in Africa, in solitary confinement, and he had this amazing sort of awakening experience where he just let go of everything, and he was aware of this kind of this deep well-being inside himself, this deep feeling of harmony, and this feeling of connection to everything. But he didn't have a background in spirituality, so he wasn't sure what to make of it. And when he returned to the UK, he got hold of a textbook of psychiatric disorders, and he started sort of going through the book trying to find out what had happened to him, assuming that he'd gone crazy. But luckily, he didn't identify or find his disorder. So then he started to think, wow, maybe I haven't gone crazy. Maybe there's something. I think intuitively he knew there was something positive about it. But eventually he realized that he hadn't gone crazy. He'd actually become sane. So that can happen when people don't have any kind of background in spirituality and don't have any means of making sense of these experiences.
Right, right. Well, do you think our culture is opening to an expanded consciousness globally that is ushering in this idea as becoming more normal?
I do believe that. Yeah, I think certainly over the past 30 years or so, and maybe even longer, if you trace it back even 300 years, I think there's been some changes gradually taking place. I think it's really picked up speed over the last 30 years or so. Certainly, I can remember when I first started to become interested in spirituality, probably about 25, 30 years ago now. It was much more, certainly here in the UK, it was much more in the background. It was quite difficult to get hold of books about spirituality in bookshops. And there were quite a few spiritual groups, but they were kind of underground. It was difficult to get access to them. But certainly since then, spirituality has become much more mainstream. And in my own research, I found that a lot of people are having these spontaneous awakenings, usually, as I've said, in the context of intense psychological turmoil, such as bereavement, addiction, depression, perhaps a diagnosis of cancer, and so on. And my feeling is I've been investigating these experiences for 15, 20 years now. And my feeling is that they are becoming more common. I think they've always been more common than most people realize, but they seem to be, so many people seem to be having these experiences. Almost every week, somebody contacts me usually every 2-3 days, somebody writes to me to describe their experience of awakening in the context of psychological turmoil. So my feeling has always been that there's a kind of an innate wakefulness inside all human beings. And we know that's the case. We know that, all human beings have an innate spiritual nature, which is kind of obscured by the ego or obscured by the stress and challenges of everyday life. But my feeling is that this innate spiritual nature is uncovering itself. It's becoming stronger. And I think there is a collective wakefulness, which is kind of picking up momentum, gaining impetus. And, and I think this points in the direction of all human beings one day attaining wakefulness. I think one day, whether that's in a few centuries or a few thousand years, assuming we actually make it that far, I think wakefulness will become human beings' normal state. I think that's the trajectory of evolution.
Nice. Oh, I'm so happy to hear you say that, because number one, I agree with it, but the pointers are all saying that. The pointers, just for the fact that 30 years ago, it was hard to find books on it, and now they're everywhere. And you can go online and you can follow traditions you never heard of, and you can find out things when people realize that these phenomenal or these mystical experiences are normal. These mystical experiences are happening because we're more than these bodysuits, and it starts to open potential to expand what we have never, what most of us we weren't schooled for it. We're not familiar with it, but as culture, as our human experience becomes more familiar with the terms that your that books point to, that all the spiritual, the myriad of spiritual references make available, it seems like this mainstream consciousness will be to be awake to
Yeah,
our
yeah.
true nature.
I believe that, yeah, and I think there is evidence that it's happening. And you could take it back even further. You could think about evolution. You could think about the trajectory of evolution ever since life emerged on this planet. I mean, evolution is partly a physical process by which living beings become more complex and more varied, but it's also an internal process of an expansion of consciousness. So as living beings become more complex physically, they also become more conscious. They become more sentient. They become more aware of the reality of the world around them. Their inner nature sort of expands. Their awareness becomes more intense in many ways. So that applies all through the evolution of living beings on this planet, right through to modern day human beings.
Yeah.
And if you think about awakening, one way of interpreting awakening, and this is the way I generally interpret it, is it's an expansion and intensification of awareness in lots of different multifaceted ways. And that's essentially what evolution has always been. So I see awakening as a continuation of the evolutionary process. And the
Yep.
evolutionary process, it has so much momentum because it's been taking place for millions of years. It's unstoppable. It has to move in the direction of intensifying awareness. And it is moving in that direction. So that's one reason why I think it's inevitable that one day human beings, or maybe other living beings, will attain a state of what we call wakefulness.
Right. And then it'll be, who knows what other faculties will follow an expanded understanding in that realm, in that mindset, as this neurological system is always on the expansion as well, just like the cosmos.
Yeah. It's a process without end. I think it will just continue to expand. I don't think there's an end point to awakening. I think it will just intensify and expand infinitely in ways that we can't comprehend.
Yeah. So going to this conversation, and I love that you're so familiar and positive on board with this idea. Locke Kelly recently said that he feels like awakening is the next phase in the evolution of consciousness. So awakening is our next phase in development.
Oh yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah.
And in a way, that's a response to the challenges we face as a species. I've mentioned already that awakening often arises in the face of crises and challenge in individuals' lives. And that may be applying to us as a species as well, because we are facing many challenges as a species. And maybe the awakening which is taking place is a response to those challenges in a similar way to, as it happens to individuals. And I think it's clear that the present materialistic worldview that most human beings have adopted, and which most cultures sort of have adopted as their worldview, is it's unsustainable. It's unsustainable. We can't carry on in this way. We can't carry on exploiting nature, treating nature as just a resource for us to abuse, to use and abuse and exploit. We can't we can't continue treating each other, as rivals and competitors.
Yeah.
And we can't continue, ignoring our own spiritual essence and treating our bodies as machines and treating each other as utilitarian objects. We have to gain a new sense of connection, or maybe an old sense of connection, to nature, to each other, and to our own beings. And that's what awakening, to an extent, that's what awakening is. It's a new sense of connection to in all of those different directions. So we have to regain that or gain that to survive and to flourish as a species.
Right, right. Well, and your new book that's coming out in April, Disconnected, is it pointing to disconnected as a symptom?
Yeah, it's an exploration of the damage and the suffering which is caused by disconnection, both psychologically or individually, and socially and culturally. So, I have this kind of a model which I call the continuum of connection. And some people are extremely disconnected and some people are extremely connected. So people who are spiritually awakened have a very powerful sense of connection. They are connected to others. They feel a strong sense of compassion for others, whether they are human beings or other living beings, because they are connected to them. They also feel strongly connected to the natural world. They feel a respect for nature, and they feel connected to the whole cosmos, to a kind of spiritual essence which pervades the whole cosmos. They recognize that their own being is a manifestation or is pervaded with this spiritual essence as well. But at the other end of the continuum of connection, we have people who are extremely disconnected, and I call them hyper disconnected people. So they live in an extreme sense of separation. Other people are just objects to them because they have no emotional connection to other people. They have no connection to nature. So nature is just a supply of resources. So they live in a kind of a solitary confinement within their own being, because they have such strongly developed ego boundaries that they are trapped inside their own personal space. And that obviously creates a lot of suffering. It creates a sense of isolation and a sense of incompleteness, which manifests itself in their behavior.
Yeah. And the question that I have is, are we more disconnected today now than we were 1,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago? Or are we more becoming more attuned to a disconnection that we've always had, as it's being recognized as what we've had for a long time?
Now, certainly over the past 300 years, I think we are going through a process of regaining connection. And I say regaining because I think if you go back, a long time ago, if you go back, say 6,000 or 10,000 years in human history, I think people did have a natural sense of connection, which is still evident in some of the world's indigenous peoples who have a strong sense of respect for nature, who feel very intensely connected with their own community. They feel that the land is a part of their identity, a part of their being. They respect other living beings. And those societies seem to be natural. Human beings have been around for probably 200 million years. And we existed in that state of natural connection for a long time, until relatively recent times, probably until a few thousand years ago. That's when a new kind of ego developed, a new separate individuated ego, which became aware of itself living in a body. It became aware of itself living in an environment, living in separation from other people. In my earlier book, I called that the fall. When it refers to the myth of the fall in the Bible. I think essentially that's what it was. It was the development of a very intense sense of ego, the sense of separation. And that's been the dominant factor in human history over the past few thousand years. The consequences of that highly individuated separate ego and all of the suffering it experiences and causes. But I think certainly over the past 300 years, we've begun to slowly move beyond that. So I sometimes refer to that as the trans-fall era. And that seems to be intensifying now. I think spirituality, or the increasing interest in spirituality, is a manifestation of this movement beyond separateness and a regaining or reintegration of our natural connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think that like when I see I haven't read your book yet, but I've read the some of the endorsements from the different uh, people that have endorsed the book, and it looks to me like disconnected is pointing to the the turmoil and the results of the disconnected mindset beginning. I mean, you could probably take it back to you could probably take it back to Roman times and look at the dictators, and if you look at the life of that dictator, it sounds like the profile of what your book is about.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think so. You can classify societies in terms of connection as well, or disconnection. And there are some societies in the world which, may not be completely connected, but a sort of balance towards the connected end of the continuum of connection. So I'm thinking of like Scandinavian societies, for example, where there's a sort of high level of respect for the human body, where there's a lot of sexual openness, a degree of democracy, egalitarianism. And then you have like extremely repressive societies, authoritarian societies, like, for example, some societies in the Middle East, or going further back in history, back to ancient Rome or ancient Greece, other early civilizations like Egypt or Sumer. There were some positive aspects of those civilizations, certainly, but they were also extremely authoritarian. They had slaves and very little opportunity for women, very few rights for women. So they're what I would call disconnected societies. And those kind of societies, they also, interestingly, tend to be quite overtly religious in a kind of fundamentalist way. Like, again, the Middle East is a good example. There are some societies like Saudi Arabia, for example, which are quite authoritarian, disconnected societies, but also very religious societies. So there seems to be a connection between dogmatic religion and disconnection. Whereas more connected societies tend to be more spiritual. They tend to be less overtly religious, but more spiritual in a kind of ecumenical, non-dogmatic way.
Yeah. Well, would you say that I mean, when you go back, if you go back, I think you have to go back pretty far. I think maybe you go back past 10,000, past 20,000 years. It seems like that was what you're describing as maybe a time when the human species was more connected, more intuitive, more caring for its community without the materialist, individuated mindset.
That's right. Yeah, there's certainly been an increasing individuation, and that manifests itself in increasing competition, decreasing egalitarianism, increased authoritarianism. That goes hand in hand with a kind of materialistic paradigm which sees human beings as machines. If you look at the kind of the standard view of human beings in many areas of science, we're seen as kind of neurochemical machines, and we're just agglomerations of matter, of material particles, and we exist in our own space with distance between us, and other human beings are just other machine-like entities. And we are rivals. We're competing for resources, so we are rivals to each other. And from that point of view, it doesn't make sense for us to be altruistic to one another, because we're competitors. Why should you be nice to your competitors? So that it goes hand in hand with that materialistic worldview. But essentially, we know it's pretty clear that materialistic worldview is wrong. Human beings are infinitely more than matter. We are spiritual beings. And we are intimately connected. We are interconnected. And once you sense your interconnectedness with other human beings, then you instinctively become altruistic and compassionate, because you realize that we are not rivals. We are one, and we are we are capable of feeling each other's pain and joy, and we are capable of helping and nurturing each other. And obviously life becomes much more harmonious when we do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe, I mean, this is just a posit that I'm thinking about, that maybe this upheaval and this the political and social turmoils and chaos that we see, so I mean, in many countries, this country, that country, many countries, maybe this is a time where the awakening experience is looking at that, and hopefully, in my mind, hopefully it's being seen for what it is, so it can be divested of the energies that are prominent within that those ideals.
I think so. Yeah, I think there is certainly a wave of awakening manifesting itself in the world, and I mean that can be an issue in itself, because once awakening manifests itself, I think there is often a kind of counter influence which also manifests itself, a kind of negative reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Because whenever something feels threatened, it always kind of steels itself. It kind of becomes more aggressive and manifests itself more strongly, because it's resisting its demise. So I think maybe that's also happening at the moment. With this wave of awakening, the old values are trying to maintain themselves. They're trying to resist their own demise.
Yeah. That totally makes sense as well. And I'm going to offer a whole other idea that I'm going to just kind of question you with. And how would you say, in this idea of disconnection or disconnected, how does technology fit into that? I mean, you have young children. How does a parent? How does technology is it against the? Is it part of the disconnect, or is it? How does it work?
It's both. Because I mean, you mentioned this earlier, that the internet allows us access to many different spiritual teachings, many different teachers, which is a good thing. I know a guy. He's passed away now, but he was a spiritual teacher I used to visit here in England. A guy called Russell Williams. He died about 5 years ago, in his 90s. But he underwent his awakening when he was 29, I think, just after the Second World War. And he didn't know, what to make of it. He didn't, as we were saying earlier, these awakenings can be confusing sometimes if you don't have a framework to make sense of them. So Russell, he spent a few years just trying to make sense of what had happened to him. He went to visit vicars and priests in churches, and he explained to them, I've undergone this kind of shift in the way I see things. Everything looks different. I feel like I'm connected to everything. I don't have any thoughts in my mind. And they thought he was crazy, obviously, because they didn't understand it. So it took him about 9 years before he met a Buddhist by chance in London. And the Buddhist said, "Wow, this sounds just like the Buddha's teachings. I think you're enlightened." And so Russell think, "Wow, phew, after all that time, I've realized now I'm actually enlightened." But that wouldn't happen now, because somebody who underwent that experience, they would maybe Google, they would find some videos of spiritual teachers. It would take them maybe a few days or a few weeks to understand what's happened to them. So that's obviously, a great thing about the internet. It's also great that that another problem with Russell, 150 or 50 years ago, is that the only spiritual teachings most people had access to would be Christianity, or some form of Christian mysticism, if they were lucky. But now we have access to Buddhism, to Hindu, varieties of Hindu teachings, to Taoism and the Kabbalah and so on. So that's a great feature of modern technology as well.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, I think, the world is becoming increasingly interconnected through the internet. And that I see that as a positive sign. We're transcending the boundaries of nationality. We're transcending the boundaries of religion. We're interacting much more. And I think, as I said before, on one level, awakening is about connection. So this increasing interconnection is a sign, or it can certainly aid awakening, this increasing interconnection. But there is a negative side, which you alluded to, that we become so immersed in technology that we forget to live in the present moment. You see so many people looking at their phones rather than looking at the sky or the world around them. So there is greater capacity for diversion and for absorption and distraction through technology. So that's the shadow side of it. But on the whole, I see it as a positive development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. Yeah, I find it. I think you're the perfect person to have this conversation with because you're dad, and I mean, you're like the rest of us. You're going, okay. You look around the room. You go to an airport. You go anywhere, and I would say more than half of everywhere more than half, unless you're in the grocery store and people are putting stuff in their cart, more than half the people have their phone out and they're looking at their phone. And Lisa, my wife, we were just talking about one of my grandchildren that we just took to New York. Well, we took her to New York last year to start school. And Lisa lived in New York City for 10 years. So she knows the subways, she knows New York City, she knows the social etiquette and the some of the uh, um, cautionary kind of behaviors that a New Yorker learns. And she was going to point some of those things out. And we're walking around New York City with my 18-year-old granddaughter. I went off to do something, and Lisa was going to show her where the library is in Penn Station and those kinds of places. And she said when she was walking with our granddaughter, all our granddaughter was doing was looking at her phone the whole time. She said she didn't even look up at a building. I was talking to her about, here's this building, here's that building, and the whole time she's got her phone out. And what is she doing? She is using an app on the phone, and she's following like 40 of her friends that are 5 streets over there. There's one, and one of her friends just passed by that's on the app. And so my question with Lisa was, well, I mean, I know she wasn't present with you for sure, but she was connected to 40 people that were all over the city. So in her experience, it was a different paradigm. She wasn't connected to the buildings or the New York that you were pointing out, but she was very connected to New York like it's never been experienced before. But at least by us, we didn't know people that were 10 streets over or uptown, downtown. All of our friends, 40 friends at the same time. So we're learning how technology fits in our social experience, and I think the jury might still be out on that.
Yeah, it's a different form of connection. But there was, I don't know if you heard of a French philosopher called Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And his main idea was that the technology of the modern world is creating a new kind of reality, which he called the noosphere. It's a specifically human phenomenon, the sphere of the mind, the collective mind. And he believed that as the modern world becomes more and more connected, and as human beings have more communication with each other, and it's literally giving birth to a new level of reality, and it's heading towards a point of complete oneness, which he called the omega point, the point where human beings become one. So he would have been, obviously he died before the era of the internet, but I think he would have been very excited by it.
Oh, yeah. Well, we're having this conversation right
Well,
now.
yeah.
You're here, I'm in America, you're in the UK, and we have meetings all the time with hundreds and thousands of people. that join together in a common discussion.
Yeah, so that's got to be a great thing.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Yes.
Well, I was listening to your ideas on awakening, and the idea of awakening being much simpler than what most people think about, and you call it an expanded. One of the things that you say is that it's an expanded awareness. Can you give some some common symptoms that people would recognize as an awakening experience is revealing itself? Can you give some of those characteristics?
One of the most obvious signs is that awakening often manifests itself initially in a different form of perception. The world around us becomes more real and more vivid and more alive and more beautiful. So it's almost as if a veil of familiarity falls away, and suddenly you find yourself noticing things that that were always there, but you didn't pay attention to. And suddenly you become more sensitive to beauty and to the fascination or the intricacy of the phenomena around you. So that's one way, but also subjectively, the mind becomes much quieter. I think it's quite rare for people to experience a complete absence of thought for a long period, at least. But a lot of people, their minds do become a lot quieter, and partly that's because they disidentify with the mind. They realize that their thought mind is not their true identity. It's just a kind of a process that takes place inside them. So they disidentify with the process. And as a result, the process becomes quieter. It slows down. It loses momentum because you don't identify with it. So that's another factor, this sort of disidentification and this quietening of mental activity. And there's an increased sense of empathy and compassion for others, because your self boundaries become softer and more permeable, if not entirely absent. So as a result, you're no longer an isolated entity trapped in your personal space. You share your being with others. You're part of the same fundamental consciousness or spirit as other people. So you sense that other people, even if you're not aware of this consciously, you sense that other people are manifestations of being just as you are. So you feel, you become sensitive to their experience, to their emotion. And that triggers a desire to be more altruistic as well, because when other people are suffering, you sense their suffering. And just as you feel an impulse to alleviate your own personal suffering, you feel the same impulse to alleviate their suffering because you feel it. And so as a result, people often become much more altruistic. And there are all kinds of ways in which awakening manifests itself in changes in behavior. So that's one of them, increased altruism, increased compassion, but also a decrease in materialistic pursuits. People are no longer so focused on achieving their ambitions or becoming successful or wealthy or famous. That desire to accumulate things fades away. So people are more content to be as they are in the present moment rather than trying to work towards future goals. Those future goals become meaningless and they become unnecessary, because if you feel complete, if you feel an innate sense of harmony and well-being, then there's no need to accumulate things. There's no need to strive to accumulate possessions, to strive to accumulate achievements, because you're complete as you are. So you don't need to add anything to yourself. So that's people normally try to simplify their lives. They declutter their lives because they feel an impulse to, on the one hand, unnecessary possessions or unnecessary achievement or status. They naturally let go of these things because they are no longer necessary. there's a desire to be in harmony with your environment, which manifests itself in simplicity, in a kind of more holistic way of living, a more harmonious way of living. So those are some of the more kind of evident signs in which it manifests itself.
Okay. And would you say that uh, being disconnected identifies the symptoms? Are there symptoms that identify being disconnected, which would sort of be the opposite of that?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. The most disconnected people are the people with the strongest desire to accumulate, the people with the strongest desire to achieve or to accumulate possessions. The most materialistic, most accumulative people, they're the ones who are most disconnected because they are so separate, they are so incomplete that they feel an almost constant need to accumulate things, to add things to themselves. I think if you feel separate, then you always feel a need to accumulate. There's always something missing. So you're continually hankering for things to try to add to yourself. Separateness also equates to a feeling of vulnerability, a feeling of being, threatened by this vast, overpowering reality out there on the other side. So you need to defend yourself. You need to add things to yourself to defend yourself. And you need to build up your sense of identity. So, you need to attach yourself to as many things as possible, to accumulate as many things as possible. So, yeah, that's why the most disconnected people do tend to be the most, they're often obsessed with power. They need to dominate others. So that's why there's a couple of chapters in my book about how disconnected people often rise to the top in terms of politics or in the corporate world. There's a whole problem of HEOs or CEOs who have psychopathic traits, politicians with psychopathic traits, and that's because they are hyper disconnected people who have a incredibly strong urge for power and for domination.
So is that what would you say was the inspiration for writing the book Disconnected?
It was a way of trying to understand human nature. There are some human beings who are incredibly altruistic, and there are some human beings who are incredibly selfish. So I think that's one of the incredible things about human beings is that we cover such a wide spectrum of behavior, from saints to psychopaths, from mystics to murderers. You got the example of let's say somebody like Gandhi or Martin Luther King, incredibly altruistic people who were willing to sacrifice their own well-being, even in their own lives, for the sake of moral principles, for the sake of other human beings. And then you have psychopathic dictators like Hitler or Stalin who were so obsessed with their own ideology that they were willing to kill millions of people or cause the deaths of millions of people in order to try to achieve their goals. So I wanted to try to understand why there was this big difference, this massive difference in human beings. And it is essentially about connection. If you are altruistic, then you are connected. You feel other people's, you feel connected to the entire human species or even to other species, and you're willing to act positively for the sake of the whole human species, because you know that your own identity is not your own. It's shared with all other beings. So you act in accordance with all of the human beings. But if you are disconnected, then nothing matters to you apart from achieving your own goals and desires. You have no empathy for others. So you're willing to persecute, exploit, even kill others in order to try to achieve your goals. So I think the essence of goodness is connection, whereas the essence of evil is disconnection.
Right. And I guess the ideas that are presented in your new book are more pointed to noticing the disconnection so that you can find the connection. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I try to do in the book is to show that we are actually connected. Connection is an essential human trait. It's an essential fact of human nature that we are manifestations of the same spiritual force or energy or consciousness, whatever you want to call it. We are all channels of the same spirit. So we are always connected. So disconnection is an aberration that happens at the level of the mind, and it's often encouraged by social conditioning. So the most disconnected people tend to be people who had a lot of trauma during childhood, people who lacked attention and affection. Obviously not everybody who has that kind of childhood becomes disconnected, but there seems to be a higher prevalence. That seems to be a causal factor in disconnection. So disconnection is not natural. Connection is natural. So in order to sense our innate connection, we really just need to attune to our true nature. We need to, go below or beyond the level of the mind, which is where separateness exists, and attune to our essence. And we naturally do that when we behave altruistically. It's such a great feeling to be kind to other human beings, to share in other people's joy, and to alleviate their suffering. It feels so fantastic because it's a connection. It's a reinforcement or an expression and an experience of our innate connection. So yeah, it's just really a process of uncovering our true nature.
Hmm. So if someone's listening or watching this broadcast and they're feeling like, I think I'm disconnected, what would you suggest that what steps would someone take that would sort of uncover or release or disconnect the disconnection, or remove the disconnect, or what would you suggest to someone?
As I just mentioned, disconnection really only exists at the level of the mind. So it's a great idea to go beyond the mind, or just to quieten the mind, just to transcend the mind. And you can do that by just kind of detuning from your thoughts. Meditation is a great way of doing that, but also spending time in nature. If you spend time in nature, you naturally detune from your mental activity. You naturally, go beyond the mind. And even physical exercise is a great way of detuning from the mind and, transcending mental activity. And once you do that, you instinctively, naturally move towards connection. As soon as you move beyond mental activity, you move towards connection. So anything natural, physical, attunes you to connection. But also altruism itself is a great way. Altruism is a manifestation of connection because it arises from empathy, which itself arises from our fundamental interconnection. But also to practice altruism is a great way of experiencing connection. Because, as I said before, when you're altruistic to somebody, you forge a connection to them. You connect with their being. But also, you often in altruism, you connect with something beyond individual being, something transcendent. So just even if you practice it consciously, altruism can have that effect. Being of service. You don't just serve another human being, you serve the whole of life itself. You serve something transcendent. So you can experience that through service and altruism.
Nice. Oh, that's awesome. Wow. Well, we've come about to the end of our time for this broadcast, Steve, and I think we've covered a lot of really amazing ideas and really current psychological and philosophical and societal kind of a conversation. And I loved every bit of it. I look forward to you being part of our conference that's coming up in a couple of weeks from this broadcast, April 21st to the 23rd. And I think you are Saturday morning, Eastern time. your session. Your
Okay,
book,
great.
Disconnected, is going to be out the 1st of April, about the time that this broadcast goes out. And I want to thank you for being able to spend this time with you and to kind of unpack some of the ideas that are in your new book, and also what's under the hood with Steve Taylor.
Yeah, no, thanks, Bill. It's been, I really enjoyed it too. It was really great to connect. Or that word again, connection. It's really great to connect with you.
Yeah, right. Yeah, actually, for our audience, this is, even though Steve he's part of the conference and we've been communicating by email, this is our first time to actually see each other. I didn't know he had a beard. He didn't know I had a goatee, kind of a beard. It's been a joy to meet you face to face, Steve. And thank you for being on the Awareness Podcast.
Likewise. Yeah, thank you very much, Bill. Thank you.